2 years ago, the rack densities were 3 kilowatt to 10 kilowatt, and all of a sudden AI showed up and the market started exploding. And now the rack densities are 40 to 100 kilowatts and expected to be 250 to 400 kilowatt. And as a result of all of these, the grid, by definition, is interested in distributing small pockets of power to many users, and the data centers, they're demanding massive amount of power instantaneously with massive transients dictated by AI. So all of these together created this situation for a lot of data center operators that they can't really rely on the grid anymore. They have to find an alternative solution, and the immediate solution, especially in the US, is the behind the meter generation. And in the behind the meter generation scenarios, natural gas becomes very attractive. Hi, this is Pooya Kabiri from METIS Power, and you're watching Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And today I am welcoming Pooya Kabiri, who is the CEO of METIS Power. We are based in Southern California. It's a power generation, microgrid, and energy storage company focused on mission critical infrastructure, including data centers. The company positions itself around flexible power generation, energy storage, microgrids, cogeneration, and behind the meter power solutions, a very, very in-demand area in today's high-density AI infrastructure environments. We're going to be talking a lot about power bottlenecks that are created by AI and data center growth, as well as the growth trajectory of METIS Power. Welcome to the podcast.
All right, thank you so much, Joshua. Glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
I'm glad to have you here as well. Thanks for joining me. So can you give me a little context on what led you to want to found METIS Power?
Sure.
And what problems you're solving in the data center industry?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think my background is primarily on power generation, and I started in MRO side of the power generation and then transitioned over into brand new assets, the design and integration of power generation equipment. And ultimately, coming to the time that data centers need a lot of power and demand a lot of power, and our expertise and the team's expertise on power generation solutions prompted us to kind of start METIS Power and be a solution provider to this industry sector along with other industrial sectors.
So that's really fascinating about how you're so focused on just this one particular kind of problem that all of a sudden 5 years ago wasn't such a big deal in the data center industry. I think a lot of the power problems really started to compound when Jensen Huang and Sam Altman started to become household names and OpenAI came out of beta. And we've seen this groundswell of support for generative AI adoption and GPUs and how much power and cooling needs they have relative to the conventional compute loads that data center facilities were running 10 years ago.
Sure, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right, Joshua. I think it was, our line of business was very much focused on supporting larger scale industrial plants and oil and gas industry prior to this wave. And now data center takes over kind of like majority of the market in terms of power generation, supply, and capacity. And other industrial sectors actually, in an extent, they're suffering as a result of not having enough capacity in the market because of the data center.
Yeah, it's led to a lot of people speaking up about actual capacity challenges and perceived capacity challenges, and is creating a lot of communications issues for a lot of data center developers, especially in the United States, which is a whole separate podcast on dealing with those kinds of challenges. But I'm really curious when it comes to reaching the kinds of stakeholders that are a good fit for what METIS Power Solutions is doing in the marketplace. Who have you found to be most receptive to the message that you're talking about in the marketplace?
So there are actually a lot of a wide range of customers and interested parties in the solution that we offer. However, I think the market is still very young in terms of the solution of around behind the meter generation, rather than kind of like the traditional way of grid connectivity and using the grid as a primary source. And as a result, I think the market is still in an exploratory phase to an extent to figure out how and when and in what format they want to use behind the meter solution. So I think if you asked me this question about a year ago or a year and a half ago, the market was still very skeptical about behind the meter solutions. And now the market is coming to realize that behind the meter solution is probably one of the primary ways to support this demand. And ultimately, there would be other ways, but they're not in reach today. So behind the meter generation becomes one of the primary factors in this market. And as a result, you will see the message of behind the meter microgrid power generation resonates with a lot of folks across the industry, from the hyperscaler to smaller developers to larger scale developers. And you basically attract a lot of different entities who are active in this field, not only the developers themselves, but also the other entities and companies that are offering parallel solutions such as cooling, such as lighting. So everybody is trying to, I think the market is trying to bring all different sides of it together to deliver one single consolidated solution to the off-takers on the other side.
What's really interesting too about the conversation around behind the meter and cogeneration and self-generation is this podcast is just about 2 years old right now. And I remember one of my first 5 or 10 guests, I think it was actually one of the first 5 guests, was the president of a colocation company in Phoenix. And at the time, it was Ian McClarty from Phoenix Nap. And he was talking about how in other countries, self-generation was really popular. And his prediction in 2 years was that it was going to become wildly popular in the US. So it's wild to see that in just 24 months, maybe 25, 26 months, how quickly the conversation around adapting to lack of grid availability has become like the front burner issue in the US data center industry.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think the grid, like, our understanding of the grid has changed over the past 2 years. I think grid, I mentioned this before, that grid is the largest machine that we as human ever built. And, it's really designed to deliver the small pockets of energy to millions of off-takers simultaneously. That's what the grid is really good at. But because of the scale of the grid, starting to adjust and make changes to it is not that easy. It takes time, it takes a lot of investment, and it's typically very slow. And at the same time, the grid is not really used to having a single massive load demand. And if you look at it historically, the cement factories, the large automotive industry complexes, they end up having their own power sources and using grid as a backup. So they stay parallel to the grid, generating their own power on site just due to this simple but fundamental fact about the grid. I'm not saying that the grid cannot support large loads, but it prefers not to. It's designed mainly toward this angle of let me distribute power to many small consumers rather than giving power to the large consumer. And as a result of this, the data center industry, and let's look at the data centers industry in parallel. 2 years ago, the rack densities were 3 kilowatt to 10 kilowatt, and all of a sudden AI showed up and the market started exploding. And now the rack densities are 40 to 100 kilowatts and expected to be 250 to 400 kilowatt. And as a result of all of these, the grid, by definition, is interested in distributing the small pockets of power to many users. And the data centers, they're demanding massive amount of power instantaneously with massive transients dictated by AI. So all of these together created this situation for a lot of data center operators that they can't really rely on the grid anymore. They have to find an alternative solution. And the immediate solution, especially in the US, is the behind the meter generation. And in the behind the meter generation scenarios, natural gas becomes very attractive. We have the largest natural gas distribution pipeline in the world, in the United States, and getting natural gas and the capacity of natural gas is, very much available. So getting it is relatively easy, and as a result, you can put generation assets next to the natural gas pipeline and start generating power relatively fast compared to the wait time in the queue to get utility interconnection, which goes from 3 to 5 years.
So, with all of that in mind, it's very clear that AI has fundamentally changed how executives throughout the data center industry, operators and developers and site planners look at both land and power. But we also know at the same time this is going on, we see a lot more IT professionals and data center real estate professionals and facilities managers doing so much more research on their own before they're ready to take a meeting with anyone in a sales context. What do you do with buyer education? How do you educate buyers before they get to that first conversation with you to make sure that they're truly understanding all of the issues that you want them to be looking at and framing, so you feel like you're in there early enough to be able to shape priorities?
Sure. No, very good question and interesting question. Look, with the rise of AI and how it's taking the whole market over, you can imagine that power becoming one of the major bottlenecks. The data center developers, hyperscale developers, they are all being bombarded with marketing and sales fluff coming from all over the place to address their power needs and demands. And so, because there's so much dollar value in this sector floating, and everybody wants to somehow reach and grab a portion of it as much as they can. So as a result, the data center developers and the hyperscalers are being bombarded with information. And majority of this information are either sales or marketing details or very sophisticated technical information about different solutions, which for the most part doesn't really address the issues on hand. So what we try to do, and we're no different than anyone else, we started on this path and then gradually realized that we should technically move away from it. So we learned that we should address the issue on hand. And for example, for behind the meter generation, in the line of business that we are, regulatory and air permitting is a major obstacle. So majority of the large developers, they look at it and they say, okay, so I'm going to hit the major source requirement. So I'm looking at 12 to 24 months waiting to go through multiple steps of regulatory process, air dispersion model, public hearing after public hearing to get there. And what we do in order to overcome this, we basically look at it and we treat 250 ton per year, which is the triggering point for becoming a major source, not as a roadblock. We treat it as a project requirement and try to engineer our solution around this requirement of 250 ton per year, and try to basically show the blueprint of how to navigate through this regulatory requirement. As a matter of fact, if you look at our website, under a dedicated data center page that we have posted a very simple chart. Our team has posted a simple chart that tells you, depending on what EPA zoning you're in, how much capacity with our solution you can deploy. And this capacity caps at what point before you start triggering the major source. And I think this very simple approach and giving the buyers the blueprint or the typical kind of like answer to the biggest problem that they're facing in the execution of their process, it starts attracting them, but at the same time starts building confidence before you hit them with a bunch of sales pitch and sales information. So it's a gradual trust building process in our mind that leads to get the confidence that is needed in order to start discussing next steps into the sales process.
You mentioned the 250 tons a year and you mentioned EPA zones. And I know with your location being in Southern California, when you look at different kinds of energy buyers in the data center industry, have you seen significant differences between the kind of conversations you're having and the buyer education that you need in California as opposed to Texas or New York or Northern Virginia? Are there significant regional differences?
There are, and so I think let's leave California aside, because California does not like fossil fuel for whatever reason. So getting a power plant up in California has a lot of complications. But let me give you two examples. A customer in Wyoming deals with a completely different structure in terms of regulatory and air permitting, which is capped at 250 ton per year, versus a customer in Dallas, Texas, which is a non-attainment EPA severe zone. So the cap there is about 70 ton per year. So there is a fundamental difference on how you engineer a solution to meet this demand and requirement, and the type of conversations that you have with your customer, depending on the region that they want to deploy the data center, is very different. So when you talk to somebody in a non-attainment area, their basically power density is capped and limited for obvious reasons, due to the regulatory requirements and air permitting to a lower limit. As a result, their strategy to go to market is very different from a customer that is deploying a much higher power capacity data center in Wyoming under a different EPA zoning. So the conversation, and this is something that is sometimes getting missed at the earliest stage by developers, that air permitting seems to be something that needs to happen sometimes in future. You need to first get the equipment to the site, but it's extremely important to make sure that these two go simultaneously, looking at the solution along with the regulatory and air permitting, and understanding what the requirements are for your particular region.
With all that in mind, Pooya, when you look at growing METIS Power, what's the go-to-market lesson that's taken you the longest to be able to pick up on and implement so far?
So very skilled and experienced engineering team. That's very much needed from the get-go, and without it, you can't succeed. So let's say you have a highly skilled engineering team, and what happens, because your solution gets plugged into the infrastructure of the data center, you technically get faced the infrastructure question more often. And it's very tempting to say yes to those questions. Hey, do you know how to basically what the regulations are around trenching, and what do we do with the drains? And you start kind of like diverging from what your core competency is, and start addressing questions that are not far away from your capabilities, but it's not really your core focus. And what basically we learned early on that was a limiting factor to our growth, that we quickly we're going to turn into a general engineering company rather than a power solution provider. And we had to just take a step back and bring the focus back on the core competency and stay within the lane of being a power solution provider, rather than trying to be addressing any possible question that comes our way, despite the fact that we have the capability to respond to it. But staying focused and keeping that focus is the key to growth and success, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I run into that all the time where on LinkedIn, for example, there's a lot of areas that I feel like I could potentially add some value on, but if it's not necessarily what I want to be known for or the focus of our practice, it's at some point, there's only so many attention cycles before you actually start fragmenting people's attention and degrading a particular brand. So in bigger companies, CMOs and PR agencies and everything lose an enormous amount of sleep over keeping people on message. But I think there is a lot to be said for truly understanding who the ideal client is, truly understanding what the addressable market is and who the most important stakeholders are, and how your company actually can help them without getting too far afield. Because 55 to 60 different business models in this industry. It's really, really easy to feel like you can dip your pinky toe in a lot of different areas.
For sure, absolutely.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing, BRIEFING. Pooya, what is a go-to-market strategy that you see a lot of your peers still clinging to? They still talk about it. They still seem to be enthusiastic about it, but you see it just not working well anymore.
So I think there are a few, but I think one of the things that is very common, and I don't think it's really a recipe for success at this point, is to push the responsibility of the power solution to the EPCs. Most of data center customers, they tend to move toward having a single point of contact and single point of accountability for their projects, and putting the EPC in charge of that, and kind of like moving away from the fact that the EPCs are fantastic in civil work, structural work, bringing the whole site together, integrating the physical assets at site, and delivering a solution at the end of the day, and putting the power solution responsibility on the EPCs. It creates this extra layer of responsibility and liability that adds cost and complexity to the project. So I think the more efficient way to go about this is to allow the EPCs to do what they're really good at, and allow a power solution provider to work simultaneous, in parallel, and in conjunction with the EPC, and deliver what they are really good at. So managing the division of a scope from the earliest stage is, in my opinion, a key thing, and allows everybody to reach their goal much faster and be more successful with less waste. I see this happening quite often around, and a lot of EPCs gets dragged into this field, and it's not their core competency. They used to do this in a different way, and now they're dragged into it. They have to develop these skills, and unfortunately the skills around the power solution is not going to get developed overnight. It takes years, and it takes kind of like time to develop these skills across a full team. And I think the future should be based on a different strategy, uh, structure around having an EPC focus on the EPC and site work, and a power solution provider focused on providing a power solution, and communication between the two entities to be solid and structured to make sure the project gets executed properly and at a timely manner.
It sounds like you've given a lot of thought about how to position different parts of the ecosystem so engineering, procurement, construction, they still have a huge role in making these giant projects happen, but not necessarily stretching them into areas of energy planning that are way outside their competence. And you mentioned earlier you had some resources on your website to help people understand the zones and where they are in terms of production and limits. When you think about creating this kind of technical content for the different kinds of stakeholders that you work with, a lot of people in sales roles, a lot of people in CEO roles find that many times this kind of technical content doesn't give them the revenue outcomes that they're looking for. Why do you think that that might be the case?
So again, very, very interesting question. I think the technical content or the technical white paper is really focused around the elegance, the technical elegance of the solution. Us as engineers, we love to talk about how we basically came up with the design that we present to you, and like the nitty gritty details in there is exciting to us, and it addresses the question of how this system works. But for the executives and C suites, it doesn't answer the so what question. So your system works perfect and works great, but so what? Like, how does it like help my business? How does it really get to the pain point, to address the pain point of my business? And I think that's primarily what is missing in a lot of these sales pitch and in a lot of these discussions that are focused and narrated around the technical context. The technical context, to an extent, become this uh, sometimes boring, unnecessary element that comes to the discussion. And at the end of the day, everybody leaves the room feeling that, okay, so I really didn't get the answer that I was looking for. So I think the key here for making the technical content really relevant is to find a way to connect the how question to the so what question that I mentioned earlier, and show the stakeholders that the particular solution that you're presenting, despite all the elegance and technical complexity that it has, in simple terms, how does it de-risk their operation? How does it ensure that their data center is not going to go dark? That it has the operational resilience that is expected, and makes sure that the cost of ownership is defined. So there is a timeline to revenue. There is a path toward the return on the investment that they're putting toward this asset to make the data center operational. So I think once this gap is bridged, and this bridge is built, then the technical content becomes relevant, and it starts becoming more and more important to the conversation. But the technical content alone, I think, is missing a very fundamental element of the discussion, and makes everybody feel like, okay, so I really didn't need this particular point. I'm looking for something else that you didn't give me. And they think that, okay, so your solution doesn't work for me, despite the fact that your solution might be a really good solution and it works, but you're not hitting the right point that they're waiting to hear from you.
Yeah, it brings up a really interesting question as well as to whether you actually can have one kind of website page, one kind of presentation, one video, one kind of asset that really serves all, or if you manage to get the CEO's attention and they're on page 2, 3, or 4 a couple of minutes into this, and they sense that it's all technical content, so they don't even get to the so what, and they're taking the link and they're forwarding it to someone much further lower down in the organization because they feel this isn't for them. So it's a question of like really being able to zero in and super customization. And I think generative AI changes it too, because it used to be like 10 years ago that people would talk to sales teams a lot earlier in the journey. Now, because of generative AI, they're speaking to people a lot later in the journey. And it changes the nature a lot of how you even comprise a sales team. In a smaller company, a relatively new company, you have luxuries that a lot of legacy companies don't have. A lot of legacy companies now are facing a moment where they're realizing that if their traditional account executives and account managers are not welcomed in a lot of these conversations because they're not seen as a peer, a lot of companies are upskilling their talent. So they are seen more like peers, or they're just saying, hey, we need to hire an engineer to be part of the sales team. I don't care if they've ever been part of a sales team before in their career. We need them because they're seen as a peer by our audience, our personas, or if they're tech focused, they're hiring career IT managers that worked in data centers before to do this. With all this in mind, what do you see sales teams consistently misunderstand about the kind of buyers that look at cogeneration, behind the meter, self-generation?
Sure. I think the sales blind spots in any industry, they exist, and there's no way to avoid them, but you at least can be aware of them. In this particular industrial sector, I think there are two things that comes to my mind. And first one is um, the as you mentioned, the standard sales approach doesn't work. It's a whole different industry. The data center buyers, they're not necessarily looking at the cheapest price available. They're not after a bargain. They are looking at a reliable solution that does not put their company's investment in jeopardy down the road, and basically does not put their job at risk. So that's one aspect of it that I think the sales teams typically misunderstand, because they come from that legacy mentality that if I beat my competition in pricing and give them like a better technical solution, then I will win this, and completely neglecting the fact that the buyers on the other side, they're looking at something very different. They're looking at reliability and resilience of the solution. So that's one generic element around this, and that's very particular to this industry sector. The other part of it is really driven by how fast this industry has changed, and the AI really changed the way this industry functions. So 2 3 years ago, everybody was just like looking for grid connections, and co-location was something very hot. Maybe 2 years ago, it's becoming less and less attractive because there is no capacity. So the grid connection is becoming less of a solution, and behind the meter solution becoming more of a relevant solution. Now, this market has to learn how the behind the meter solution works very quickly, and a lot of people on the buyer side, they don't really know much about the behind the meter solution, and they're trying to educate, rightfully so, they're trying to educate themselves and going through the cycle of learning about the different solutions. With all these, noises in the market, they have to cut through the chase and get to the real deal. So as a result, they show up on your radar, and their intent is to just simply understand what you have to offer, and that's it. They really do not have a solution selected in their mind, and they are not ready to execute. But the mistake the sales team typically do is that they treat every single inquiry coming up in the pipeline as this serious data center inquiry. As long as it has a data center tag on it, everybody jumps up and starts running toward it. And in reality, you will end up, if you have a buyer that is just there to learn more about it, you will end up in this long, over a year sales cycle, bleeding engineering resources, because this sales is very technical. It's not just selling a standard off the shelf asset, it's a very customized technical solution. So you will end up bleeding a lot of engineering assets throughout the sales cycle with getting no uh, meaningful results at the end, and you'll get a thank you at the end from the buyer. They learned what they needed to learn and they move on, and you're left with all the time and energy and resources that you spent on it. So I think one of the key things that we always make sure of is that we try to vet the inquiries coming in at the very beginning, to make sure that we're not getting into these blind spots and these traps throughout our sales cycle. And I think these are the two major ones that I can think of, especially in this industry sector.
Pooya, how are you finding on these kinds of deals, on these projects, is the true economic decision maker the last word that has to sign off? And is it always the same, or is it varying a little bit depending on the company size?
It varies, but what I found for the most part is the you need to kind of when you enter to the data center arena, data center industry, to sell a solution like this, you need to speak to the engineer and you need to speak to the CFO at the same time. You can't just ignore the CFO or ignore the engineer. Most of these companies, they either have their own on staff engineers or an engineering team that provides consulting to them. Those guys are technical gatekeepers that will look at the technical aspect of your project and try to scrutinize it and make sure that it meets the purpose, right? So that's what their function is. But at the same time, the technical solution alone doesn't really mean anything. Your commercial solution needs to really fit in the financial model that the CFO, the institutional investors, and others have. And if you miss either one of them, the deal is not going to basically conclude. So you basically need to run these two simultaneously and make sure that you satisfy the questions from the technical team while you're providing and helping the C-suite on the commercial solution, and make sure these two work in parallel, but come together toward the end in order to have a deal. At any point in the process, if you lose the technical competency or the commercial competency, the deal is gone and you won't be able to get there. And the reason I'm saying that it needs to be handled simultaneously, you can go on and spend few months of engineering to satisfy the technical side of the deal, just to realize that at the commercial level, your solution is not really an attractive deal for the company. Or you can basically go the other way around, have the very attractive commercial solution without the technical substance behind it. So it, in a nutshell, I think the two are hand in hand needed and needed to be handled simultaneously from two different fronts. And you need to have within your organization, you need to have the capabilities to speak both languages, the technical term and the commercial term, in order to satisfy both sides of the spectrum.
Bilingual, essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Uh, Pooya, in growing METIS Power, is there anything along the way that you tried outsourcing and that turned out with a resolution that you would never outsource again? What is there something that you found that's so core that it always needs to stay in house?
Sure. Uh, Very, very good question. And yes, so again, the speed to market or speed of this market really drives a lot of initiatives in the companies and players in this market. So we initially basically started using the standard project management softwares and cost estimating software off the shelf basic products that are out there. And for us to utilize these softwares and bring them together in order to generate a meaningful proposal to our customers, it took us forever. It was so hard because none of these are tailored or customized to our specific industry and the way that we do things. And it was extremely difficult to generate an error-free and sound proposal to our customers, and it would take a long time to get there. So what we realized after a while is that the bottleneck in our process is actually the tools that we are using. And we basically stopped at that point and started just developing all of these in-house, although it was painful initially, but the result and the reward was incredible. So we ended up with a system that we know the ins and outs of it and we can control it, and it's completely tailored to how we do things. It allows us to generate a very comprehensive proposals to our customer, respond back to them in a matter of days rather than weeks, and stand out from the competition in the market, and allows us to hit the points that they need. So from technical perspective, we have a full technical details to the extent that they need, not more than enough. And from the commercial perspective, we check all the boxes that they're looking for. This actually helps the customer to gain more confidence. And at the end of the day, the next level of discussion is on how do we move toward execution rather than getting stuck on little technical details here and there that they were missing, or little commercial terms that they were not spelled out. So to summarize, I think we would never ever allow some of the key tools that we use for day-to-day business and addressing our customer needs to be outsourced or come from a third party. We always keep that in house, and we tend to make sure that this is something that we have full control over.
So usually when I talk with people about that, they're pointing to some kind of professional services or some kind of contractors or something else. It seems like your experience has been a lot more centered on like off-the-shelf SaaS that didn't give you what you were looking for in terms of configuring price quotes and project management. Did you end up building your own tech stack for that?
We did. We
Yeah.
basically we tried quite a bit of different solutions out in the market, and we just couldn't really get what we needed. Like every one of them was strong in a certain aspect and lacked in others, and we realized that it would basically slow us down in execution and kills our resources in terms of efficiency. So we decided to just develop this from the ground up based on how we do this and how we do this in house. And we built it. As I said, it was painful initially, but the results was really rewarding. And we are super happy that we have this in house and developed, under our control.
And however painful it was, I can assure you that developing this in the 2020s was much, much less painful than building something,
For sure.
building custom software 10 years or 20 years ago.
For sure.
Pooya, the final area that I wanted to ask you about today is to get your forecast, your prediction. When you look into the crystal ball, what do you think is going to change about growing a company like METIS Power over the next 12, 18, 24 months?
Sure. I think there are. Let me kind of like address where I think the market is going first, because that kind of like gives us a better path toward where METIS Power is going. So I think the market is more and more moving away from having their destiny controlled by others. And what I mean by that, if you look at similar examples in the industrial evolution, the automotive industry and aviation industry, they initially started as a flat type of organizations and evolved toward a vertically integrated platforms that portion of their supply chain they owned, or portion of the critical infrastructure that they needed to operate, they either had control over or they owned it. And I think data centers are realizing that they need to move toward becoming a vertically integrated solution, and have some control over the cooling solutions, the power solutions, the rack density and rack structure solutions. So this is becoming more and more obvious that data centers need to move into that direction and have more control over different elements impacting their operations. Now, how do we evolve around this? And I think METIS Power's goal is to be there and support the solutions that the data centers need in terms of power in that vertical integration model that they have, and make sure that they can have an autonomous data asset that can generate, store, and manage its own power demand completely independently without relying on grid or any other source of energy. I think that's where we shine. That's where we want to be. We want to partner with data center developers and hyperscalers and assist them on the power aspect of the business, given that we have very attractive lead time to the market, and this kind of like allows us to help them reach to the revenue much faster compared to the traditional path in the market. So I think that's where we are, that's where we shine, that's where we want to be in this basically next 12 to 24 months.
So not only having more of a vertically integrated role in all of the interdependencies with power, but taking a lead in not only helping them solve the power and energy generation problems, but being the one to teach them how to think about power and energy generation differently than they are today.
Sure, absolutely. I think, as I said, the market is trying to really get a good handle over this microgrid behind the meter generation. And we're trying to, in a nutshell, translate megawatt to months. And what I mean by that is to address the pain point of the data center, which is the speed to market, and it's being limited by the power availability, rather than just, hey, we have this capacity. And alongside with it, the quality of that capacity is equally important. So we're not just delivering megawatts and translating it into months. We're delivering megawatts at the quality that can handle the AI workload. That's why we restructured the architecture of our power solution, brought the generation asset with the storage asset, and developed the microgrid architecture around it to help monitor the demand and be able to immediately respond to that demand within the millisecond requirements that data centers have. So I think it's a fast evolving situation, and having a power solution provider by your side will just help you, rather than trying to figure it out from the point zero to wherever you want to go as a data center. So power solution providers could play a very fundamental role in helping the data centers to get to the market and revenue much faster.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how you're approaching this with growing METIS Power. And as I mentioned before, as recently as 2 years ago, very few people in the US were talking to me about self-generating power. Over in Europe, a little bit more because of all the sustainability directives, but it's only really been in the US that it's become such a big issue, blocking so much data center development. So really cool to hear your perspective on the different kinds of stakeholders, the different kinds of messaging, who cares about what, how the markets are segmented, and how your approach to go to market is being shaped by real-time demands and where you can add the most value. Pooya, if someone wants to keep up with what you're working on or reach out and get in touch, is LinkedIn the best place to start?
LinkedIn is the best place to start. And, of course, our website always have different tools and means to contact us and the sales team.
Cool. Yeah, I'll make sure to include a link to your LinkedIn profile and your company page, as well as the website in the show notes, so people are able to find you after they've gotten a chance to watch or listen to this episode. But yeah, I know a lot of people throughout data center energy and power, throughout facilities, construction, real estate, investors, data center operators are going to be super interested to hear the insights that you've shared today. I really appreciate you joining me today on the podcast. I've been speaking today with Pooya Kabiri, who is the CEO of METIS Power in Southern California. Thanks for joining me, Pooya.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing, BRIEFING.